Our next speaker is a person who has a very impressive resume. In fact, she has a very long list of firsts to her credits. The Right Reverend Vashti Murphy McKenzie is the 117th Bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and she is the presiding prelate of the 10th Episcopal District. Her historic election in the year 2000 represents the first time in over 213-year history of the A.M.E. Church a woman had attained the level of episcopal office. She has served in several districts. As I stated earlier, she's currently the presiding prelate of the 10th Episcopal District. Bishop McKenzie is the author of 6 books. She is the national chaplain for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the largest predominantly African American sorority of college-trained women. Bishop McKenzie is the wife of former NBA player Dr. Stan McKenzie. They are the parents of 3 adult children and 2 grandchildren. Welcome, Bishop Vashti Murphy McKenzie.
Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It really is an honor to be invited to share in this historic celebration. And thank you, President Ella Good Johnson, for this seminal honor. And I greet you and the entire membership of the Women's Council of Dallas. Greetings to all of the elected and officials from the county, the city, and the state, elected officials, honored guests, to the judge, to Dr. Sorrell, and friends and everywhere all over. This is a wonderful occasion. Today we celebrate that the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granted women the right to vote. And Texas was the 34th state to ratify this amendment. And since then, women who were behind the scenes already, working and organizing, fundraising, they began to vote, and vote they did, as well as taking their place in the pantheon of elected officials. Women ran and are running for local, state, and national offices. Women occupying key advisory positions. Women community organizers, architects of political platforms, and still are fundraising and contributors to campaigns, and have been the accountability partners to assure what was promised before the election is done after the election. Today we look back and we realize that it took 72 years from the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments in 1848 to the National Women's Right to Vote in 1920. It took courage to even speak of women's rights at a time when female voices were just beginning to be heard beyond the bedroom and the kitchen. The world we live in, this pandemic-ridden one thing after another world of ours, you cannot leave home without your courage. Courage is an essential element to raise your voice and vote and reach for what doesn't exist for you. It is necessary. It is undeniable. It is also underrated. You cannot get through the day or an election season without it. I'm talking about courage today. It takes courage to get out of the bed and face a day you have never seen before, not knowing how it's going to end. It takes courage to live with a global health pandemic, an economic pandemic, and an ongoing racial pandemic, wildfires in the West, hurricanes in Texas, random acts of violence, and hissy fits everywhere. It takes courage. It took courage for 300 women to gather in the summer of 1848 at Seneca Falls, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, to affirm the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. Now, Stanton wanted to add one more thing to this declaration, and that thing was an unpopular item, and that is to include in this declaration the sentiment about women voting. And it took courage for her to insist on it being added. And wait for it. And it took the courage of Frederick Douglass. Yes, that Frederick Douglass, who made a speech on the night that the Declaration was ratified. And because of that speech, that women's rights, women enfranchisement sentiment was included in that declaration. And this is what it said. We resolve that it is the duty of women of this country to secure themselves their sacred right to elective franchise. It took courage for the women in the state of Texas to speak in favor of resolutions to enfranchise women to the delegates of 2 constitutional conventions in the 19th century. It took courage for women to lobby Congress. No, not just lobby, but pressure Congress to pass what was sometimes known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. It took courage to organize the National American Women's Suffrage Association with its committees in the South, and for 2 states, Colorado and Wyoming, to give women the right to vote 30 years prior to the national women's suffrage. Courageous journalists and publishers who just happened to be women developed newspapers and wrote articles dedicated to the women's right to vote. Other weekly and daily newspapers of the time also had much to say about the matter, including Jovita Idar. She was a journalist writing in her family's Spanish language newspaper in the early 1900s. And this is what she wrote. She wrote, "Working women, proudly raise your chins and face the fight. The time of your degradation has passed." Of course, all media was not so kind. One article where an official said, ignore the suffragists calling for the right to vote. Ignore the nagging of iron-jawed angels. They were bewildered, deluded creatures with short skirts and short hair. Well, my grandmother neither was deluded, bewildered, or iron-jawed. She didn't have short hair and she wore long skirts. And she marched in the infamous women's suffrage procession of 1913. This was a massive major protest in the nation's capital the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated president of the United States, and he was not an advocate of women to vote. It was a brilliant idea of 28-year-old Alice Paul. Imagine 5,000 women, 5,000 suffragettes marching in close order with 500,000 watching the procession of women peacefully protesting being denied the access to vote. My grandmother marched with 21 of her college classmates from Howard University. It was improper, however, for young ladies to be off campus without a chaperone. So they had to convince a professor, yes, an ally, who would go with them. And they were all founders of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, the largest predominantly African-American service sorority of college-educated women in the world, with over 300,000 members and 9,000 chapters or more globally. Now understand that African American women were not encouraged to march that day. Noted journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett was denied the opportunity to march with the Illinois women, but when that delegation passed her on the sidelines, she jumped in and marched right next to them anyhow. And understand that march in 1913 with 5,000 suffragettes and 22 African-American women in that procession, it was not pretty. The peaceful protesters, according to newspapers' accounts, said that these women were spit on. Peaceful protesters, the women were slapped in the face as they marched. These women, peaceful protesters, were tripped and pushed to the ground. Peaceful protesters, women, were pelted with lit cigar butts. Peaceful protesters were yelled at. Peaceful protesters were insulted by jeers and obscene language that the newspaper said was too vile to print or repeat. 200 women were injured in that protest march, and 100 women were hospitalized. How dare you not vote when these women and all the women before them went through all of this just so that you could go to the ballot box and make a choice? And it was reported that the police refused to intervene. The jury is out on that. Some said they did, some said they didn't. But in the publication, the Women's Journal, it was reported that the nation is aroused by the open insults of women. And of course, Congress was going to investigate. My grandmother and her classmates marched in that suffragette procession, knowing that when women were granted access to vote, that they would not have unfettered access to the vote. Shall I back up and say that again? My grandmother and her sisters marched in that suffragette procession, knowing that when women were granted access to the vote, that they would not have unfettered access to the vote. One writer once said, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when we must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because it was right. Vashti Murphy and all of her sorority sisters marched because it was the right thing to do. And that hasn't changed. It is the 21st century. It is 2020. And we must vote because it is the right thing to do. Or maybe, just maybe, they understood that the violation of your neighbor's right today lays the foundation for the violation of your right tomorrow. The violation of your neighbor's right to vote lays the foundation for the violation of your right tomorrow. Surely there were more rallies led by courageous women. Yes, lots of them from big cities and small towns, from urban to rural. There were protests, lots of them, marches, lots of them for 72 years, parades, processions, lots of them, to get to the 19th Amendment passed in 1919 and formally adopted in the U.S. Constitution on August the 26th in 1920. And it says, Section 1, the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. My sisters and my brothers, the journey to the right to vote was a long, winding, complicated process, paved with pitfalls that took years to overcome. Women were not just granted the right to vote, they fought for the right to vote. And the fight is not over. The victory on paper for the 19th Amendment, for the 15th Amendment, for the Indian Citizens Act of 1924, for the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s, did not end real barriers to the vote. The fight is not over, and it's going to take courage. Every generation must be sure to secure unfettered access to the vote for women, for men, for males, for female, for everybody, all Americans. Every generation must gather the courage to fight for the right to vote for everybody, regardless of gender or race, creed, color. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed and we are not in despair. We're persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. That's not Vashti's word. That's God's word. 2 Corinthians 4, 8 and 9. And so it's going to take courage in hard-pressed times and cast down times and abandoned times and push times and crushed times. It's going to take courage for you to vote and think for yourself in a world that tries to mold and shape your opinions and shake and rattle and roll all over your belief system. It's going to take courage to stand out in a crowd when doing so puts a target on your back. It's going to take courage, my sisters, to speak up when your job and your title and your position would benefit from your silence. It's going to take courage for us to be creative when doing so may be misunderstood as self-promotion. Did I say it's going to take courage? It's going to take courage to strive towards excellence when the program for the day only supports mediocrity. Today, my brothers and my sisters, you will find that you're going to need more than courage. You will need to find the courage of your convictions to face the nuances of this day and time. Courage to refuse to normalize negative, vile, entrenched images, stereotypes, and practices, and speak truth in the face of bold-faced lies. Yeah, courage is taking the step anyway, doing the job anyway, facing the opposition anyway, helping other people to register to vote anyway, checking on your own voter registration anyway, making sure that there are enough polling places anyway, keeping people safe during the election season anyway, volunteering to be a poll watcher anyway, taking your children to vote with you as a demonstration of civic responsibility anyway. Courage is putting your socks on when you have no shoes. It's setting the table when there is no food. It's planning a budget when there is no money. It's looking for houses when you're still living in your mama's house. It's helping your child with their homework in the back seat of the car because you have nowhere else to live. It is sewing on your own wings and flying where imagination has no boundaries and where no goal is unreachable. For to whom much is given, still much is required. Excuse me. We cannot begin to imagine the courage it took for the women who marched in the 19th century. They protested. They dared to rally. They made speeches, endured pain, were hit and pushed. They were jailed and ridiculed so that we could vote. How dare you vote? How dare you stay home? How dare you? We need the kind of courage that calls us to speak when everyone is silent. We need the kind of courage to act while others are still shocked. We need the kind of courage to move forward when a retreat has been announced. It is the kind of courage that reaches beyond self to impact the lives of others for generations to come. It is an uncommon courage. And an uncommon courage means that we work together towards a solution to problems facing our city, our county, our nation, our neighborhood. Even if it doesn't touch your house, your home, your kitchen, or your backyard. An uncommon courage is refusing to play the blame game. That is somehow your fault you're sick. Somehow it's your fault that you have pre-existing conditions. And dignity denied your grandparents in the sunset of their years, that they should be collateral damage in a pandemic? We can't afford to keep working on each other because that's the real deal. The real deal is to get us to turn on each other. You against me and he against her and they against them. Organize against each other. Orange against purple, pink against brown, black against white, polka dot against striped, plaid. That's the real deal. For as long as we're nipping at each other's heels, we will miss what is important and significant and true. We must be smarter than that. And I tell you, if I was in church, I'd say, touch your neighbor, say, we can be smarter than that. We must find the uncommon courage to work together to guarantee that everybody has unfettered access to the vote, to the ballot box, to the voting machines, the absentee ballots, to equip voting precincts in every election without fear or intimidation. Remember, the violation of your neighbor's rights lays the foundation for the violation of your rights. The violation of your neighbor's rights today lays the foundation for the violation of your rights tomorrow. Too many people bled, died, and jailed for your right to vote. Don't mess this up. Vote. Thank you for inviting me to share. I pray that you have something to run and tell somebody else that this is the season. Now is the time to vote.